Welcome to the New Wealth Wave podcast hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. We're diving deep into the intricate layers of the 7-stage generational wealth model to offer invaluable insights on legacy building, wealth accumulation and preservation, and financial growth across generations. I'm Dr. Joaquin Wallace, and this is the New Wealth Wave podcast. Hey, future wealth builders. Welcome to another episode of the New Wealth Wave podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Joaquin Wallace, and today we are focusing on stage 2 of my 7-stage generational wealth model, and who will be leading the discussion will be Rahkim Sabree, a friend of the program who is AFC certified and also a Forbes contributor, and this is his second appearance in the studio. Rahkim, my man, welcome back to the studio.
Thank you for having me.
Rahkim's first appearance was in our first season, episode 11. And since then, we've been keeping up with him from afar, watching him grow as well. And today, he's going to give us a sneak preview of his upcoming book, scheduled for release in November 2025, titled Overcoming Financial Trauma. Now, if this is your first time tapping into the New Wealth Wave podcast, make sure you hit the subscribe button below so you can get all of the current content, look at some of our past episodes as well. Also, make sure if you haven't already, pick up my book, Generational Wealth Begins with Generational Knowledge. It is a bestseller on Amazon in 3 categories. Also, it was best new book released as well. So make sure you pick that up. Now, again, the podcast is based on my 7-stage generational wealth model. So let's get into it. Stage 1 is our internal and external ecosystem, where we focus on walls in and walls out, those inherited financial narratives, encoded financial behaviors that have been generationally willed to us, unbeknownst to us. Stage 2 is financial genetic code. We focus on financial trauma and anxiety. Rahkim will be focusing on that this afternoon. Stage 3 is financial healing. This is where we reprogram our financial genetic code, which is a byproduct of stage 1, our internal and external ecosystem. Stage 4 is financial edification, where we focus on financial inclusion and literacy. Stage 5 is financial well-being. Soft landing, making sure financial health is financial wealth. Stage 6 is generational knowledge. This is where we create those financial footprints to achieve stage 7, generational wealth. Now, again, this is Rahkim's second time on the podcast. Now, the first time we asked Rahkim this question, Rahkim, you had a chance to look at the model back then, a year ago. Now we've grown since then. What are your initial thoughts now compared to then?
Yeah, so I don't remember how I responded in the last episode, but I think with a better understanding of the model, I'm probably in between stage 5 and 6. And I may have responded in that way. Now that I'm thinking about it, I may have responded in that way last time, but definitely in between stage 5 and 6.
So with your clients itself, where do you see them at within the model? Stage 1, 2, because I know you deal with a lot of financial trauma. We're going to talk about your 6 episodes in regards to financial trauma itself, but a lot of those inherited financial narratives, encoded financial behaviors, how do you see that coming into play?
Interestingly, as I look at this model, I incorporate aspects of stage 1, probably up through stage 5 in the work that I do and in my client-facing work. Since the last time we met, I moved away from working with individuals one-on-one and really more so focused on working with B2B organizations. So the spectrum of professionals that I'm working with generally include financial service providers or financial adjacent providers, right? So they're financial counselors, they're financial planners, they may be in real estate, they may be CPAs, but they're the ones who are working one-on-one with their clients. And what's interesting about working with this audience is that most times when they come to me, they are expecting to walk away with simply more tools to serve their clients. What the unintended or unexpected byproduct of working with me usually surfaces is that they have their own inner work to do. And so if you can imagine a room of 40 to 50 people coming in at different stages on the wealth model, being in the same space and talking about what those experiences look like individually or collectively, and then reconciling within themselves the healing that's necessary for them to be more effective in their roles with the people that they serve, it is kind of a mixed match, if you will, of different experiences. So I won't say that they all exist in any one stage or another. I think that what's really interesting is that I get to see kind of a combination of experiences that land on different steps in this model.
Rakim, I'm glad you said that because when I created the book was geared towards the five financial professionals: financial planner, the advisor, the educator, the counselor, and the therapist. Those were the five. And I'm glad you mentioned that because oftentimes they don't think they need any help, right? But in order to be effective, they have to do their own interpersonal inventory to move forward. And I'm glad you mentioned that because that's exactly what the book was designed for, those individuals, but also the regular individual as well. First question for you is: you've written and spoken extensively about financial trauma. How do you personally define it? And what are some of the most overlooked ways it shows up in our daily financial behaviors?
I personally define financial trauma as any instance observed or experienced that has a negative impact on the way you view, interact with, or believe about money. When we search for a definition on financial trauma, at least in my own research and trying to find a definition for financial trauma that was different from mine, I noticed that a lot of the references to financial traumas were that, right? They were references, they weren't definitions. Financial trauma was kind of lumped under a category of psychotherapy, right? That says, okay, this individual is experiencing some flashpoint financial experience or has experienced prolonged financial stress or financial anxiety, right? But there has not been this universally agreed upon definition. So my hope in publishing the book and talking about financial trauma as extensively as I have is to create some standardization of how we define financial trauma. Now, to answer your second question, I think that the most overlooked symptoms of financial trauma or sources of financial trauma, if we can call it that, are the vicarious or observational forms of financial trauma, right? So these are secondary experiences, right? They're not experiences that the individual is having directly. If we can, just kind of draw a contrast, when financial trauma is traditionally discussed or previously discussed, it's usually like you experience this issue, right? Whether it's, the eviction or poverty or repossession or job loss. More often, we don't see the vicarious examples of trauma where we're observing somebody's financial hardship, right? So if we are children and we see our parents struggling, what kind of impact that has on us and our navigation of money. We don't incorporate, and you talk about this in stage one of your model, the generational ideas around money that are passed down. That's something that I talk about as one of 6 sources that I've identified in financial trauma. But actually, we more frequently than not talk about financial hardship or poverty as a source of financial trauma. But I think the phrasing or the framing of that as a source of financial trauma also kind of alienates those individuals who are experiencing financial trauma at higher income, higher net worth experiences, right? So there's the assumption that because you have money or you have access to money that you are somehow immune to financial trauma. I think another overlooked source of financial trauma is workplace and employment trauma, right? So when we look at what are the behaviors that we have to engage in order to secure a paycheck, what are the things that we have to ignore? What are the things that we have to endure? A lot of times those can be financially traumatic because we're engaged in economic warfare in order for us to survive. I just recently have made a piece of content for social media where I'm saying I'm noticing the pipeline of employee to entrepreneur marked by financial trauma, right? People are fleeing their places of employment and going into entrepreneurship ill prepared more often than not because they're trying to get away from this pervasive source of trauma that is often ignored. So I think those are some of the top under the radar, non-mentioned sources of financial trauma. And then, of course, we have what we usually associate with financial trauma, those direct experiences.
Excellent answer. Excellent answer. So in my book, I talk about the financial genetic code, those inherited financial narratives, fears, and encoded financial behaviors that's been passed down unbeknownst to us generationally, as I mentioned earlier. In your experience, how can individuals begin to differentiate between their own financial beliefs and those that have been passed down through trauma, scarcity, and survival culture?
Great question. When I look at the 6 sources of financial trauma, right, and I have one categorized as genetic/generational, I think it's important to note that although they're being used in the same sentence or the same breath, that they are very different. To your point, that generational financial trauma may come from internalized beliefs, behaviors, attitudes when it comes to money that are passed down, right? Classic example, credit cards are bad, or I don't trust the bank because XYZ. But I think in pulling back some of the layers, when we look at it from a physiological perspective or biological perspective through the emerging study of epigenetics, that there are physiological reactions to sustained trauma from previous generations that come from, poverty, that come from exclusion, right? So when we look at how I may butcher the pronunciation of this, but methylation of certain proteins when experiencing these traumatic experiences or these high stress experiences, and we see how the change in expression of genes occur that may result in heightened levels or heightened sensitivity to cortisol and how we carry cortisol in our body. That can be a response to not just generalized stress or generalized trauma, but specific financial trauma. And so when we look at it from that biological perspective, then it's not just the ideas and attitudes that we internalize by way of word of mouth or observation. It's something that's in our body. Okay, we're in an environment that is high stress. And because we're in an environment that's high stress, we're more sensitive to those stress responses. And so people in a state of dysregulation are looking for ways to regulate their nervous system by way of money, whether that looks like spending, whether that looks like hoarding, whether that looks like not spending, or the avoidance behaviors or the vigilance behaviors that are often described in these environments. So going back to your question, how do we address these things, right? I think that there's an education piece where we're challenging the narratives or rewriting the narratives. And you have this in stage 3 and 4 of your model. Then there's also the somatic kind of healing or somatic relief that comes with addressing what's happening in the body. In my studies of trauma broadly and the application of these studies to financial trauma specifically, one of the things that I've come across is that trauma is often described as a psychological event. The truth is that trauma is more so a physiological event, a somatic event. When we experience trauma, we hold that trauma in our bodies. And so when we approach the healing of trauma through a lens of rationale by way of talk therapy, narrative-based therapy, education, or exclusively education, there are aspects to those experiences that we are still carrying in our body that we don't get the opportunity to metabolize or exercise out. And so my realization and recommendation to healing financial trauma has to incorporate some form of somatic healing where we ask the individual, where do you feel the trauma in your body? One of the questions that I pose to the groups that I work with often is, do you feel safe in your body when it comes to money? And a lot of times the answer that I receive when phrased that way, and given the education around what financial trauma is and sources of financial trauma and how it shows up, a resounding no. And that's not an unexpected response from me going into these spaces, where I think the value in having this conversation and getting people to agree or recognize that they don't feel safe in their bodies when it comes to money is that we can begin to now have conversations around what does it mean to be dysregulated in terms of our nervous system, and what does it mean to get to a place where we can re-regulate. I know I'm going deep really fast, but I think that we are constantly in a state of dysregulation because a dysregulated human is profitable. So when we start to point at systems that we navigate and we look at the way that advertising is weaponized against us to spend, to buy, to consume, we are constantly in a state of dysregulation through the news cycles, through what is being thrown at us with advertising, through the ideas and the messaging around where our value lies and whether or not our income or our credit score or our assets are equivalent with our value as a human being. And if we do not reach XYZ milestone financially by whatever this time is, that somehow we are of less value than another human being. And the socialization that we experience when looking at individuals who are experiencing poverty or individuals who are unhoused, right? There is a negative association with that population of people that we are often more closely, I don't want to say aligned to, but we are closer to and experience than we are to the multimillionaire, billionaire crowd, but we experience this negative association that says, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be treated like that. I don't want to be considered that way. And I think that that explains a lot of the behavior that we notice when it comes to consumer debt, when it comes to this idea of keeping up with the Joneses, when it comes to this idea of wealth signaling that says, hey, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that people do not associate me with this group.
I'm glad you touched on that because I mean, that was a very articulate answer. Based upon that answer, I've seen how much you've grown since the last time that we actually met. You've done a lot more research in regards to trauma itself. I love your answer because what you just mentioned in regards to what I see, that's the external piece of it, walls out. And I'm very like 10 toes down in regards to that, walls in and walls out, because as we see, we think. And that's so important in this process. So let's zoom out a little bit here. What role does community, especially in marginalized populations, play in both perpetuating and healing financial trauma?
Love this question. In fact, as I heard you ask this question, I got a chill down my spine because I feel very passionate about this in the work that I'm doing and also what it is that I've researched and uncovered. The role of community. Before I answer this question, I think we have to define community and we have to define culture. And this is not for me to define. I think as the individual is reflecting on this conversation, that is what they have to do internally. But in defining community and in defining culture, the role of community in overcoming financial trauma is significant. It is one of 4 steps that I talk about in the healing process for so many reasons. But to list a few, we may learn the things that we need to learn from a financial edification perspective that says, okay, I understand how to navigate these systems. I understand what makes me successful in the navigation of these systems. However, going back to this idea of dysregulation, I'm constantly being bombarded with variables that put me in a dysregulated state. In addition to the different attacks on my body, I am also in an environment where the people around me are engaging in a behavior that they are trying to regulate their nervous systems by way of using money that is inconsistent with what it is that I have learned to make me effective in navigating these financial systems. So when we talk about community, the role of community, we have to be able to define, to offer, and to buy into a culture that is in alignment with our values and our goals. If we can define or redefine culture in alignment with our values and our goals, we can then surround ourselves with people that are going to reinforce the positive behaviors or the desirable behaviors associated with money in line with those values and those goals. And so that's one reason. When we talk about the somatic aspect of healing trauma, right, from a physiological perspective, what I've come to realize is that capitalism, which is the dominant economic system that we partake in willingly or unwillingly, prioritizes individualism. So individualism leads to increased consumption, right? Because I need to have my own and you need to have your own and we can't share. So when we look at how that clashes with some of the wider practices across the world, they're more collectivist, right? We're working together for this common cause. Is in direct opposition of this idea of individualism that is upheld by these ideals around capitalism. If everybody's problem is an individual problem and not a collective problem, then they're isolated. And in isolation, it's easier to keep somebody dysregulated. If we move into more communal based approaches to not only building wealth, but healing, now your problem is our problem. Financial trauma is not an individual problem, it is a social problem. What are the ways in which we can work to regulate collectively instead of as individuals? And to just go into a little bit more of the science, there is a theory around the way that our bodies respond to threats that speak to co-regulation, known as polyvagal theory, right? So, it's often referenced to the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve being a collection of bodily systems that start with the brainstem and go down into our throat, our lungs, our stomach, where we feel safe or where we feel in danger, where we feel threatened, but also in recognizing in other human beings through their body language and facial expressions, whether or not safety exists with them. And so one of the biggest things that I pulled from polyvagal theory in relation to financial trauma is that we often, as human beings, because we're social creatures, looks at other human beings to determine whether or not the environment or the individual is a safe individual. And so, in the act of co regulating, we can establish a healing environment by way of engaging with a community of people who are focused on healing. We're talking about it from a bodily healing perspective or a somatic healing perspective in terms of co regulation. We're talking about it from a social reinforcement perspective by way of this is a community of people who are aligned to my values, who are aligned to my goals, particularly financially. They're not going to put me in spaces where I have to enforce the financial boundaries that I'm now learning how to erect. A lot of times, just as an example, when we spend quality time with people, what are we doing in that quality time? Most times there's a cost associated, right? We're going out for drinks, we're going out for food, we're going out for whatever. And so, in the process of spending time with somebody else, oftentimes we also spend money. If that is not in alignment with our financial goals by way of our budget, or we have to create a line item in our budget to account for that, how much or how frequently or how easily is it for us to deviate from our goals because the value system that we have prioritizes spending time with this person and having conversations around establishing boundaries. And this is a frequent conversation that I have with clients, whether that be one-on-one or in a group setting. The erecting of financial boundaries has to look like not only recognizing that no is a complete sentence, but also no is a complete sentence with the understanding that, hey, I want to communicate with you that I value spending time with you, that you are an important person in my community. But also, I don't want every time I spend time with you to be a money event, right? Let us walk through the park, right? Let us have a picnic. Let us congregate at my house or at your house, right? Or a place where, we don't have to spend any money. And so giving people the tools and the language to articulate their no in a way that is not misinterpreted as you don't have any value to me or I don't value spending time with you because I can't spend money or because I don't want to spend money with you is, I think, an important step. So I know that was a very big answer to your question, but I'm just super passionate about this idea that building community and maintaining community is an absolutely crucial piece to the healing process when it comes to trauma in general, but financial trauma specifically.
I'm glad you was able to articulate that answer. Future Wealth Builders, welcome to the New Wealth Wave podcast. And today we have Rahkim Sabree in the studio discussing his upcoming book, Overcoming Financial Trauma. Also, be sure to hit the subscribe button below. Most importantly, if you haven't already picked up my new book, Generational Wealth Begins with Generational Knowledge, please do so. It's on Amazon. It's a bestseller as well in 3 financial categories. Now, Rahkim, I know that we touched on your 6 sources of financial trauma. So I'm going to ask you, give us those 6 bullet points because it's extremely important. And I know how passionate you are about those.
Sure. So the 6 sources of financial trauma, as I have experienced and researched, are generational and genetic, right? So we talked about that briefly. Vicarious or observational, poverty or financial instability, institutional or systemic. There is workplace or employment, and there is familial, societal, or religious. So I grouped the familial, societal, or religious into one category.
So now let's get into what everyone wants to know about your upcoming book. This is a 2-part question for you. So first question, what prompted you to write the book? And the second question is, what do you hope to gain from its release?
Good questions. What prompted me to write the book? I have been talking about financial trauma and the way that I talk about financial trauma for almost half a decade now, which is crazy. Like the time just flies by. By many accounts, I am some individuals' first exposure to the term financial trauma. When I first started talking about financial trauma, I didn't hear anybody else talking about it. I didn't know that it was even a thing outside of my own development. I think I may have shared this the last time we spoke. Since then, especially today, everywhere you look, somebody's talking about financial trauma, financial trauma, financial trauma. And so for me, not that I'm looking for validation in the space. I think I've created enough of a buzz to feel validated. But I think further amplification and kind of staking my flag, if you will, on this approach to financial trauma and financial healing is a big part of my reasoning for writing the book, from my reasoning in partnering with a publisher to write the book, really to further the thought leadership that I've already embarked on through, various other channels. But as I was writing the book, I think what I realized is that in talking about financial trauma before writing the book, I had removed myself from the equation, often pointing to different narrative based experiences that I've had to exemplify what I'm talking about. Since then, I have had to center myself in the process of writing the book, right? I started with the vision of writing this as the expert, authority, professional, if you will, from a very academic lens, and very quickly realized that I have my own work to do when it comes to addressing financial trauma. The process of writing the book was a very healing process for me as I analyzed experiences that I have had throughout my life from the time of childhood up into present day, analyze some of the interpersonal relationships that I've had with key people in my life, like my parents. What is the vantage point that I had as a child going through certain experiences related to money in relation to my mother versus in relation to my father? What are some of the financial narratives that I had adopted during that time period and had upheld up through present day? What are some of the driving and motivating factors in the work that I do as a trauma-informed financial practitioner and educator, right? Is my work informed by pain, right? By trauma? And if so, I don't want to speak around it, right? Yes, certainly it is. But as a result, how can my healing amplify the healing of other people? When I think about who I wrote the book for, the audience that I had in mind as I was writing the book, they say, you should have one person in mind, right? You should not be writing for a bunch of people. I had to really narrow down this avatar of the individual who is going through a transformation. And that individual going through the transformation may have experienced income in excess of what it is that they've seen their peers experience, right? And as a result of experiencing these highs in income, may not have the resources, the community, the education to know what to do with that money, and may end up giving it away, or may end up spending it away, or may end up vigilantly holding it because they're like, hey, I didn't have this before and now I do. If I think about the singular person that I was writing this book for, the more I wrote about it, the more clear the image of that individual became. And that individual was a version of me that existed, let's call it 10 years ago. That exists. Shadows of that individual exists still in this present day. What do I hope to gain with the release of this book? I think I have high hopes and expectations. When I think about the version of me that existed in 2019 when I published Financially Irresponsible, which was my second self-published book, and the success that I had at that particular point in time, I had no audience, I had no credentials, I had no credibility in the space. And since then, I have built, I don't want to call it an empire because that word has a negative connotation, I think, but I've built a community of people who are inclusive of financial professionals, inclusive of financial academics, inclusive of financial practitioners. I've built a lot of social capital over the years. I have won awards and accolades, and now my audience is significantly larger. And so I'm expecting that this book is going to be embraced by this population of people, and that's going to expose me to a new population of people. I'm not looking for fame. I think this time around, I think when I wrote Financially Irresponsible, I worked with a book coach and he asked me, what do you want this book to do for you? And I'm like, I want to be on TV. And I think there was such a big focus on establishing the authority and credibility that came as a result. But now I'm like, if I could fade away into the shadows, I'm cool with that. I just want to have the impact. If this book is adopted as a part of some educational institution's curriculum, whether that be in the space of social work or psychology or financial planning, that would be wonderful. If this book is adopted as a tool for practitioners in the field of financial counseling or financial therapy, that would be a win. If this book is a rave bestseller, right, in the retail world of individuals buying books, that would be great. But I think my focus is more on institutional alignment and moving the conversation forward around financial trauma, specifically financial therapy broadly, to have people take it more seriously, right? I think We exist in these echo chambers as financial professionals, as financial educators that say, okay, we are around people who are in alignment with what we're talking about, who can acknowledge that the stages of your model or the conversations that I'm having in my models are present. But the reality is that I think that an overwhelming majority of financial professionals or financial adjacent professionals do not acknowledge these variables as existing, as being valid, as being necessary to discuss, that they would prefer the status quo or older approaches to money that speaks to just the raw numbers. And I think a big part of the reason for opting in that direction is that it reinforces the comfort that they feel. It reinforces the systems that have perpetuated harm. It reinforces power in the way that they have experienced it. And this book is an indictment of all of that, right? It's an indictment of the financial systems. It's an indictment of capitalism. It's an indictment of financial professionals who use shame and guilt and fear to motivate their clients. It's an indictment of racism and institutional harm and the banking systems and why people throw a stat out there at you. FDIC is doing reports on the unbanked and the underbanked recently. The most recent report that came out, I believe it was in 2023. The number one reason for the surveyed population of unbanked individuals, for those individuals not being banked, not having bank accounts, was that they did not believe that they could afford the fees associated with maintaining an account with a bank. The number two reason was that they didn't trust banks. I love bringing this up because people often say that like numbers don't lie. And what I've learned in working in and around numbers, particularly in the banking world, is that numbers can be manipulated to tell whatever story you want it to tell. And so when we look at those two statistics as individual variables, they tell very different stories that reinforce this idea of, oh, well, we need more financial literacy, right? We need to promote financial literacy in these communities. But when we look at these variables combined, it tells a different story. And it tells a story of institutional abuse. It tells a story of harm. It tells a story of a survival response that these individuals who are considered unbanked or underbanked are engaged in to protect themselves, which is the primary function of our brains, right? That says, you hurt me, and so I don't want to continue to exist in a space where that harm has been perpetuated. The fees that you are charging are excessive. I don't trust you because, right? What is the reason why? And again, as we talk about financial professionals being agents of the system, if we continue to opt into the partial truth that we need more financial literacy, it is ignoring the variables that have alienated this group of people from wanting to participate in the system, right? Because you may or may not agree with me here. Financial literacy, when we get down to the root of it, is how well you learn how to navigate these financial systems. But if you are acknowledging these financial systems as the source of harm in your existence, then it doesn't matter how well you know how to navigate these financial systems because you do not want to participate in these systems. I want to be clear here where I'm not saying that I don't believe in financial literacy for all, right? Everybody should know how to navigate these financial systems. But I think that when we look at the question that I had asked earlier, do you feel safe in your body when it comes to money? That a lot of the reason why people don't feel safe is because the systems that we are often forced to navigate have created an environment where safety is not an option.
I love how you tapped into that question. And in my book, I identify 20 inherited financial narratives. And one of them is I labeled it as scar tissue narrative. And that's exactly what you're talking about. We have these scars, these wounds that we continue to carry on, although they're healed, but they're still there. You can look at your skin and say, okay, I was cut here. Something happened along the line that takes you back to that moment. And again, when you're talking about trust in the financial systems, the banking systems and things of that nature, that's a byproduct of scar tissue narrative because something may have happened in their home, they've seen in their community, and they do not trust the system itself. That's a great segue. Now, you mentioned earlier the abundance and you see the swelling of this space now in terms of financial trauma. So my question to you is, financial trauma is becoming an increasingly popular topic, but the space can often feel fragmented and oversaturated. What intentional steps are you taking to differentiate your voice and maintain impact in this evolving conversation?
Man, you hitting me with some good questions today. One of the variables that I'm using to determine how I feel about whether or not this is a good question is like how deeply it resonates in my chest. This question is deeply resonant because I have to constantly work internally on myself to feel comfortable with celebrating the fact that other people are talking about financial trauma, even if I don't agree with the way that they're talking about financial trauma. So, in doing the work, the answer to your question is that what is for me, right? And I'm choosing consciously not to view other people's success or exposure in the space of financial trauma as a threat to the work that I'm doing. So that's the first one. The second one is there's that old saying, right? It comes out in the wash. People are jumping on the bandwagon to talk about financial trauma because it is a hot topic right now. It sounds provocative, it sounds sexy in the world of financial conversations, right? But I think that because people hear the phrase and maybe they can relate to some of the ways that it's been referred to as or in the way that it's been described, they're like, oh yeah, I could go on and I can go and talk about this. I think what separates me from the crowd when talking about financial trauma is that a lot of the thought that I have on the topic is both informed by my own experiences, but also informed by continuous effort in studying and improving, right? So even if we can use my appearances here as an example, when we talked about financial trauma the first time, my understanding of financial trauma was like here, right? But I thought at that particular point in time that I was an expert in financial trauma. And now we're talking about financial trauma again, and my understanding of financial trauma is here, and I feel like even more of an expert. But I realize like the more that I know, the more that I don't know. And I think that people are tribal. People tend to exist in these silos when it comes to how do we stake claim on the phrase financial trauma? Where does financial trauma live? Is this a financial therapy exclusive term? Is this a financial counseling exclusive term? Is this a psychotherapy term or a therapy broadly term or a social work term? Where does it live? And what I found in discussing financial trauma and what I found in defining financial trauma, particularly through the lens of writing this book, is that my approach to this conversation is interdisciplinary. I pull on sources that include neuroscience and quantum theory through Joe Dispenza's work with Becoming Supernatural. I pull on the work of Dr. Claude Anderson as an economist and a capitalist, where I'm challenging capitalism, certainly pulling on his work as an economist. I'm pulling on the work of Dr. Joy DeGroy and Dr. Restma Menakem, who are in the social work and therapy fields, specifically around intergenerational trauma, the transfer of intergenerational trauma through a racialized trauma lens. And then, of course, I'm pulling on the work of Dr. Brad Klontz and, financial psychology, financial therapy, financial counseling. All of these textbooks are surfaced in my book as well, right? And so we have a concept that does not fit cleanly in the space of personal finance or financial planning or social work or psychology or quantum theory or neuroscience, but exist on the edges of all of these things. And I think when we talk about healing through a lens of money, or rather, when we talk about money through a lens of healing, that we have to acknowledge a holistic approach to what this work means, and that in acknowledging this holistic approach, we have to kind of abandon the silos and the tribalism that we are often inclined to engage in. When I was writing this book, I thought I was going to be writing it through financial therapy as defined by the Financial Therapy Association lens. And that's not the case, right? There was a huge departure from that, in that I said, hey, this is my professional community and my professional home, right? AFCPE, Financial Therapy Association, shout out to all of them. However, I've been talking about financial trauma before I even understood what these organizations were. So let me remove myself from the banner of Financial Therapy Association, AFCPE, whoever it is that I'm affiliated with, and talk to you as a real person who's gone through this experience. But I found that was extremely liberating, and that I think others will find when they read the book that it's also very freeing to say, hey, I don't have to wear my CFP hat or my CFT hat or my, AFC hat to approach these conversations, because these are human experiences. These are not just existing in the realm of academia or in the realm of practitioner or in the realm of financial professional. Going back to a previous question that you asked, like, what is my hope, right? My hope is to be able to provide people with language and vocabulary to not only describe what's happening to them, but to describe the ways in which they can heal from it.
Well, I'm hopeful one day that you can add me to your sources as well. To your sites
Yes,
as well.
for sure, for sure.
No, when you wrote the book, when you were writing the book, I was writing my book as well. So I give you that one. But your next one, I know that there's some nuggets in there I know you can pull and
Yeah, I
use
mean,
that as
there's
well.
absolutely some overlap in your generational wealth model. And really, this book is based over a framework that I introduced that I call the three E's. I had been calling affectionately the three E's, but I have firmed up the language and introduced it as the three E's of overcoming financial trauma. When I look at the models next to each other, the 7 stages that exist within your model also exist within my model. Just you might have stage 1, 2, and 3 exist in the first E, right, which is exposure. And then several other stages exist in the education piece. And then several other stages exist in the execution piece. What I like about your model that's very different from my model is the stages 6 and 7 that talk about generational knowledge and generational wealth are not things that I explicitly talk about in my model because my focus is just the financial trauma healing, right? And so those conversations would exist within the education phase that says, okay, here's financial literacy, here's my indictment of financial literacy or financial education, but here's where it's necessary. And how do we have these conversations to improve the impact of financial education? But I think there's absolutely alignment because your book is now in the world. And I'm quoted in your book, right? I think that's an important thing that we haven't talked about.
Yeah, I talked about you in the story in the book as well. I think it's chapter 3, I believe you're in that chapter 3. We talk about your aha moment. I thought that was very integral in terms of what we do because we took a lot of the podcast testimonials in terms of the transcripts and intertwining within the book itself. So it gave it a nice flow. And that's what the readers are saying. And that's what the reviews are saying as well. So, Rahkim, great episode as always. I want to thank you for not only naming what so many of us have carried in silence, but also, offering a path forward to our listeners. If today's episode resonated with you, grab yourself a copy of the book that I released, Generational Wealth Begins with Generational Knowledge, and begin your journey from financial survival to legacy. And Rahkim, on behalf of the Future Wealth Builders, my producer, Ray Haycraft, I would like to extend to you gratitude for joining us in the studio today to discuss the release of his upcoming book, Overcoming Financial Trauma. Make sure you get that. It's in November, Barnes & Noble, I do believe. And Future Wealth Builders, as we always say, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. I'll see you on the next episode of the New Wealth Wave podcast. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for joining us on the New Wealth Wave podcast, hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. Our show is edited and produced by Ray Haycraft. To dive deeper into the world of financial wisdom and learn how to create your financial footprints, head to our website at www.drjwallace.com. For more updates and exclusive content, connect with us on social media by searching Dr. Joaquin Wallace. And if you have questions and comments, feel free to email us at thenewwealthwavepodcast@gmail.com. Remember, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. And as always, thanks for listening. The content presented in this podcast is strictly for educational purposes and should not be taken as investment advice. The views and opinions expressed by our guests may not necessarily reflect those of the New Wealth Wave podcast and its host or producers. Listeners are urged to exercise discretion and judgment before making any financial or investment decisions. Always consult with a financial professional or advisor before taking any action based on the content of this podcast. If you're enjoying the New Wealth Wave podcast, we appreciate if you leave us a review. We're always open to topic suggestions and guest recommendations. Feel free to reach out to us directly with your thoughts and feedback. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the New Wealth